What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 126, and I'm the host, Kyle Anslone. On today's show, I have a fantastic interview that I did with Brian Saady on the war on drugs and how it impacts U.S. geopolitics, where drugs are produced, how they end up in the U.S., and how the U.S. policies to try to fight the war on drugs impacts all these Central and South American countries. So there's so much great information in today's show. Honestly, I wish I could have interviewed Brian for 3 hours and broken all this down so much more, but I'll definitely have him back on the show to talk more. But there again, everybody's going to get so much out of this episode. I highly recommend it. I really want you all to share this one because I want this one to get out to as many people as possible. We're talking about the drug war and foreign policy. Super important. The video version at Odysee and YouTube. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, so you could get the show notes, and my daily news roundup at libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle. You can find the show on any of the social media accounts, Facebook, MeWe, or Twitter. You could donate on Patreon and Subscribestar, and you could get yourself some great CBD products at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, for 25% off when you check out. And their CBD products are absolutely fantastic. Everything's got lab tested results, so when they say there's X number of milligrams in the bottle, X number of milligrams in each pill or gummy or milligram of the extract, you know you're getting exactly what they say on the bottle, and that way it works the same way for you every time. So it's consistent dosing, and that helps you. It's absolutely fantastic. I really like their topicals. I've been using their sports cream a lot. It's great for any back pain that I have, and I put it on every morning, and I love the menthol smell to wake me up. It's so much better than the other sports cream alternatives that are either causing icy and hots, or they have very strong smells. So check out Paloma Verde, get yourself some great products, and be sure to use the promo code PEACE, PEACE. And here's the interview with Brian Saady. Hey Brian, how you doing today? Welcome to Conflicts of Interest.
Man, I'm great, man. It's been a while.
Yeah, so for anybody who's an old listener of Foreign Policy Focus, you'll definitely recognize Brian. We had a few conversations about the drug war and some criminality in the UAE and how international crime works. He's done some great work, and I think your most recent article is at the American Conservative. And you also have your website, briansaady.com. But and you post news stories there not every day, but most days of the week. I see two or three new interesting stories, and sometimes I actually poach them for my news roundup, so I appreciate that.
Cool.
But
That's awesome.
yeah, so anyways, I think we have a really awesome subject to get into today, and talking about the war on drugs. And on the show I've made the point in the past that I think the war on drugs is really foreign policy, with the way it impacts is particularly the Western Hemisphere. And so we're going to get into a lot of that today, and I guess we were going to kind of just start with Colombia. I got some maps and everything for people to see, so if you're not exactly familiar with the geography of Latin and South America, definitely check out the video version of this show. But Brian, go ahead and just start queuing us up about what the whole situation with the drug war is, how is this going on, and then the corruption in the U.S. role.
Gotcha, man. So I think the drug war is a complex issue. So there's a lot of stuff, at surface level, we can talk about. One of the things that I've been so passionate, it's been, I focus on a lot of different topics, but this is probably my favorite topic to focus on. And when you talk to an American audience and you talk about the drug war, we're typically thinking about, mass incarceration. It's a failed U.S. policy, and it absolutely is. Destroyed a lot of lives, created a lot of violence. But the thing that I think that I know that the vast majority of Americans, they're not aware of really the destruction, the chaos that this policy has created throughout the world. And yeah, that was one of the things we were going to kind of talk about. And there's different illegal drugs, but I really kind of wanted to focus on this hemisphere. A couple of the main production countries as far as cocaine. And again, there are different illegal drugs, as well, and some of the main transit countries. And to basically dovetail to what you were saying there, the drug war really is foreign policy. And I've kind of given it a lot of names, and I've heard other scholars and stuff and kind of refer to it in different ways. But I kind of like to point out that it is basically an extension of the Cold War, soft, in a way. But there's also another aspect that I do try to bring up is, and I don't hear it, in my opinion, quite as much as we should in the anti-war movement, of pointing out that this really is a war as well. When you look at the stats and the violence, that goes along with, in several areas, from the warring groups trying to sell this stuff, the cartels, the guerrilla groups associated with the trade. Again, when you look at the level of violence associated with the black market of drugs in many countries, it really rivals a war zone. When you look at the statistics for people who are displaced within their own country because of the levels of violence, and again, not entirely, from the drug war, but in a large part from the drug war, in my opinion, these several parts of the world are war zones, as a result, in large part, of the war on drugs. Some of the tactics, the brutality, the severity, you'll see parallels. You'll see, Mexican cartels and Colombian cartels using tactics that, if you just read the story in the headline of like what was done, you're like, what's the difference between them and ISIS, and some of these terrorist groups? So, I mean, it really is a war. But one of the things I really wanted to highlight, and again, it's another aspect that I think that the average American is not aware of, is just sort of the disingenuous nature, or sort of the politics from how this war on drugs, some people will say, is managed or is fought, because there's a lot of politics in how the U.S. uses this war on drugs. So yeah, you wanted to start off with Colombia.
Yep.
So it's probably the best place to start, at least as far as this topic. Again, we're talking cocaine production. So Colombia is the number one producer of cocaine in the world. And again, it's in very concentrated areas. Personally, I have a lot of Colombian American friends, and they hate that reputation. And a lot of times people just sort of, stereotype anybody from that area. So I don't want that to be the takeaway from this. I want people to kind of look at this a little bit deeper. And in many ways, there's an arrogance pointed towards the average Colombian. And I really think that finger should be pointed towards the United States. So where do I start with that? So let's say this. So again, Colombia at this time is now the top producer, head and shoulders, of cocaine, right? Not for the lack of trying on the U.S.'s part. There's a thing called Plan Colombia back in 1999. In other words, we've been arming the Colombian government to the teeth in the name of the war on drugs. And in no way has the situation improved as far as reducing the production of cocaine in that country. What it really has been is an effective counterinsurgency policy. I don't know exactly what you want to label it, but it's been very politicized. So in Colombia for decades, roughly 5 decades, there's a civil war, and there still technically sort of is one. And again, it comes down to sort of this left-right labeling, but there's communist guerrillas, multiple groups. The main one called the FARC. They actually went into a peace agreement back in 2016. There's another one called the ELN. And when I say, communist group, sometimes, and again, your average American audience, sometimes thinking of like hippies in the park, kicking hacky sacks around. But no, like these are actual terrorist groups trying to overthrow the country. And they're essentially at war with the government, with the police. It's trying to, insert their agenda. So some of that Cold War extension, it's very real. So even though the Cold War ended officially a long time ago, there are still some of these types of groups out there in small numbers.
And Just
Okay.
real quick, wasn't Biden, or our current president, a big supporter of Plan Colombia? And then just a small anecdote: Ron
Hmm.
Paul used to talk about how when he was in Congress, I think it was
Hmm.
for the One Colombia Day, whenever like they had the hearings on Capitol Hill, he would say that the only interest groups that would show up were the attack helicopter lobby. So all those like military industrial complex would show up. And so, just another way that this is a part of, the military industrial complex, the US empire, our foreign policy. Right here we have the military industrial complex, boosting this policy. So yeah, go ahead with the if you know about the Biden connection.
I do point to the Democrat Party again. That came out of the Clinton administration. Funny enough, Al Gore was really one of the bigger supporters. There was when you're speaking of conflicts of interest, not to be no pun intended there, right? But there were a lot of corporate interests, and absolutely Ron Paul's right about that. So there are a lot of these military contractors. This is a very sweetheart deal for them. We provide a lot of military hardware, a lot of weapons, et cetera. We've given billions of dollars in military aid over the last 20 something years through Plan Colombia. But I do want to point out there's a lesser known aspect to that. It wasn't just the military contractors who were big proponents of Plan Colombia. It was actually oil companies. Guess what? Colombia has a ton of natural resources. So these different terrorists, Marxist group, there's also paramilitary groups, which we'll go into as well, kind of state-sponsored terrorist organizations. Well, guess what? They extort, they conduct these, terrorist acts in order to get money from big companies. So a lot of these oil companies were some of the biggest lobbyists in favor of Plan Colombia. In other words, we want to use our military might to help the Colombian military to protect those U.S. Foreign interests, so that we can go in there and extract those resources with as little bloodshed as possible. And again, I'm oversimplifying in a way, but I am just trying to give a snapshot. But when you look at the actual lobbying and spending, a lot of the biggest proponents in the beginning were oil companies. I do like to point out Occidental Petroleum. Al Gore had ownership in there, and I mean there was a genuine conflict of interest there in
Right.
the beginning, because they drill there in Colombia, and to kind of get it back to current times. So there's different unrest in certain areas and stuff. I'm drawing a blank right now which Canadian oil company has been affected by some of the violence in the region there. And I think they're actually talking about, again, I'm drawing a blank of which one, talking about pulling out. Again, it's just, and again, Colombia is a very peaceful country in most of the parts, but there are certain areas um, where there is a certain level of violence. And what, again, I try to point out to, it's enabled by this black market. And again, there's other forms of organized crime, et cetera. And it is my general theory that if we could eliminate that black market, you would really reduce quite a bit of the violence. And again, I'm not saying it's some panacea like the world just, just becomes this perfect place if we can end the war on drugs, but it really would have a big impact. But yeah, the military contractors are some of the biggest proponents of Plan Colombia. And a lot of it comes down, so they want to do eradication, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Dying Corp is one of those companies. They want to go in there and spray over these fields. So one of the biggest problems is it's not very accurate. So there are people, and there's cocaine production, but there are also farmers who are farming legitimate crops. But when they come in there and they spray that stuff, it just kind of goes everywhere and it kills everything in
Mm-hmm.
its sight. There's literally been lawsuits for, I mean, where the chemicals literally even drift across country lines. So again, the U.S. we come in here and we're saying that's what's going to end this war on drugs, and that's how we're going to stop the flow of cocaine all the way up here to America, and we're just creating a lot of destruction in the process.
Right.
I'm trying to remember a story. I think like the late Paul Wellstone, if I remember, was him. They were trying to demonstrate the accuracy of these sprays, and he's supposed to stand there and watch it. And again, it actually ended up drifted and ended up hitting him while they're trying to demonstrate the accuracy of what
And
they're doing.
is this like safe? You're raising a family at the farm, and it happens to be next to somewhere they think there's cocaine, and they spray
Mhm.
it. Like I've seen some of the horrific pictures from the probably the depleted uranium or the burn pits in Iraq or the Agent Orange in Vietnam. Kids with these terrible disfigurations and cancer. Could that be causing it? And then I was also just gonna add, I read a year or two ago a story about how they were trying to do less of the, I guess, aerosol, getting rid of it and doing more on the ground, going through and just
Mhm.
ripping out the plants. But I guess then they started booby trapping the fields with all kinds of like,
Mhm.
bear traps or whatever they would be called, or even like landmines and claymores, and they were,
Mhm.
blowing
Yeah.
people up. And so, it just, like, I think I made the point on the show at the time, just like how much violence that we're enforcing on Colombia, that we're forcing to break out by trying to make them get rid of these plants.
Yeah, so Monsanto is the producer of that chemical. And listen, I don't want to get sued for libel or anything, but there have been civil cases, and they've ruled against Monsanto and saying that it is cancerous. No, it's definitely not. I wouldn't say on the level of Agent Orange, but there seems to be a lot of medical evidence to suggest so, in my opinion. But yeah, I mean and again, a lot of this stuff is just benefiting U.S. interests. So you got to think about it also from the agent's point of view. That is the easier path. You can just fly over, because the lower that you get, obviously, the more accurate you're going to be with the spraying. Well, guess what, though? There is risk in what they're doing. There are armed groups who don't want you doing that, and they will shoot at your plane and try to kill you
Mm-hmm.
for doing that as well. So, let's try to be balanced, about this as well. But again, that's why they don't want to get low, because there's more risk. And if you're higher, obviously you're kind of spraying everything, and you're punishing a lot of people in the process. So yeah, I mean it's just one of many examples. I would probably point to. I mean, there's a lot of stuff here to unfold. It just going into Colombia and the U.S. response to it. The biggest thing that I really try to focus on is, again, the hypocrisy of our policy. So most of what you hear about the communist, guerrillas, the FARC. Again, most of them, they went into a peace agreement back in 2016, and part of that agreement was they lay down their arms. They're supposed to be provided government protection, because guess what? They've got a lot of people who want to kill them. And the thing is, there really has been no government protection. Hundreds of these people, they've been murdered. They're living in special, isolated spots. They're supposed to be provided with protection. The other problem is, guess what? You still have this black market of cocaine. So there's a lot of these dissident groups who are saying, nope, we're not stopping. We're going to keep doing this. But let me just kind of back up for a second. But that's mostly what you hear in the U.S. media. You always hear about the communists who are profiting from this and poisoning, the American youth, et cetera. But the vast majority of this stuff, in the war crimes and the violence, was really committed by these right wing paramilitary groups. Now, those groups have disbanded as well. They're splintered. The technical term is Bakrams, and they're not quite as right wing aligned. But when I was talking about it originally, when I say, like, if we're going to point a finger and we're going to point some blame, I'd point a lot of that blame at the U.S. government. And what I mean by that, it's one of the links that we included in there earlier, is the link between the highest levels of the Colombian government with the drug trade, and this all being fully known by the United States. Yet we've continued to arm and arm this country with this weaponry all along, because again, the real intention, in my opinion, is not really to end the flow of drugs. Not really. It's really more about arming these groups so that we can stop a communist group from overtaking this country, that's a U.S. and military ally, that sits on top of a lot of very valuable natural resources like gold, silver, coltan, oil. And what I was referring to there, again, we've got it in there, is the former president of Colombia, Alvaro Uribe. Um, I mean, there's just endless evidence that he's been linked with those terrorist paramilitary groups, yet that was all kind of swept under the rug. And numerous evidence that these paramilitary groups were committing massacres in full. And when you look at the statistics as far as that civil war, basically double the violence. I mean, there was a truth commission there. like double the violence was committed by really essentially the state forces, the paramilitary side were linked with essentially this right of center government, the strong US ally. And again, we just keep arming them, and it's just all kind of been swept under the rug. And it's a very convenient narrative because, again, there is a lot of cocaine production out of that country. But the thing that and again, I'm going to oversimplify it, but you got to remember that really is essentially an extension of the U.S. empire. There, we're arming these groups that we have dedicated indirectly, have actually designated as terrorist groups. The largest group in the past was called the AUC. Again, they've splintered off into several groups, and they're no longer really quite as politically aligned. They're really more of like organized crime groups. But these groups were all aligned with the top business people who were then in the pocket of the politicians. And again, these politicians were, for lack of a better term, hand in hand with the U.S. government. And they're going around and committing just horrible terrorist acts, stealing people's land. There's a scandal called the parapolitics. So, in other words, I'm going to sum it up real quickly. Basically, around 15% of the land mass in Colombia at some point has been stolen from a landowner. Now, some of that was also committed by the communist guerrillas, but the vast majority of that was done by the right-wing paramilitary groups. And there are people who are trying to get their land back, and there's still just a lot of this violence committed by the state or committed by essentially proxies of the state to just not allow just basic human rights in a country. And again, we continue to fund this indirectly, and I don't ever see really an end to that. And again, it's just because it's such a convenient narrative. We just say, well, we got to stop the flow of cocaine. So we got to keep arming and funding this plan in Colombia.
So I think we should move on to Peru, and maybe this is a question that you can answer more generally, about South America and cocaine. But not
Mm-hmm.
only is the U.S. I guess it would be a different situation if the Colombians were like, "Oh my God, we had this terrible cocaine problem. Everybody's doing cocaine all the time and going crazy." But a
Mm-hmm.
lot of this cocaine isn't staying in Colombia. It's ending up in
No.
the US. And
Mm-hmm.
so you have it kind of the US double dealing on this. And I'm guessing like a lot of the same elites, I'm not like accusing any particular person of doing a bunch of cocaine, but I'm guessing there's a lot of people who work as executives for these military industrial complexes who enjoy a line every now and then. And so, they're not only selling Colombia the helicopters to, go and fight these wars or to eradicate the cocaine, but then they're
Mm-hmm.
also, funding the drug dealers, indirectly, at least by, buying the product
Mm-hmm.
at the end. So I'm just curious of how
Yeah.
much of what's produced in South America in general ends up in the US.
The exact percentages. The
Right.
U.S. is the highest demand country in the world. I kind of break it down into more regions because the U.S. uses more cocaine than all of Europe combined, but it's fairly close. So let's not pretend that this only goes to Europe, and let's not pretend that none of this makes its way through any of those transit countries as well. But I don't remember the stats off of the top of my head, but that's probably the simpler explanation. I would probably stress the point that if you combine all of the illegal drug market, the general estimate is that it's around $100 billion black market annually. And I remember before you'd asked for some links, and there was one I was trying to find, but it just stuck permanently in my brain. It was one of these reports by Insight Crime. They study a lot of the organized crime throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. And again, on the subject of Colombia, and we'll switch back to Peru, but it's just always stuck in my mind when I was referring to those Bakram groups, the splinter groups from the paramilitaries. They showed this just dilapidated wood home that was basically the size of a prison cell, and four young men are all crammed into it. But the thing that I have to give the reference, or I guess how do I explain? But that was essentially the upward mobility for these people, because in a lot of these areas, like there's no infrastructure, they're just kind of, and you go in those really remote regions, that's that demand for cocaine, that's what people are going to come for. There's no real infrastructure to transport, a legal good. But what I was getting to there is, again, this, I wish I could provide it for you because a picture tells 1,000 words. But people, they literally had to murder somebody in order to move up into the ranks so that you could move into something that any American would just be devastated. The thought of having to live in that. And again, it's 4 men in an unair conditioned, basically like jail cell size wooden shack. So I mean, the level of disparity of what these people have to do just to survive, it's just asinine for any American to think that criminalizing this stuff can stop it. I'm sorry, I just kind of got off on a little rant there. Okay, but yeah, you asked about Peru. So yeah, it's very topical, and I do think we're going to start to see some developments. So yeah, when we look at this map, let me kind of simplify some things for everyone. Essentially, the vast majority of the entire world's cocaine comes from 3 countries right there. It's Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, with the majority of that coming from Colombia. So I think this is an interesting topic for a couple of reasons with Peru, and it's another one of these examples, in my opinion, of the real hypocrisy. So there's a recent election that took place. Um, Pedro Castillo and Kiko Fujimori. Um, that name may be familiar for like an older audience member, the Fujimori name. So her father was basically a dictator a few decades back, and very much a U.S. Puppet dictator. And again, this contrast of how the drug war actually works in practice, I think it's a pretty apt comparison. So, and I'll wrap it back to the current situation. So, long story short, there's a guy, acting as a dictator, committing war crimes, literally forcing indigenous people to be forcibly sterilized. I mean, I don't want to go in too long. Again, we only have so much time. But this was somebody who was an absolute darling of the CIA and the U.S. And his actual intelligence chief, Montesinos, he was essentially like his de facto intelligence chief, was basically an extension of the Medellin cartel. This was all very well known, but again, gets back to kind of what we've been talking about. In the 80s, we were given a whole lot of money to the country of Peru. At that time, there was a different communist, guerrilla group that really, and again, their level of violence was even higher than the FARC. It's called the Shining Path. So this communist guerrilla group, I mean, I think if I'm remembering off the top of my head, like responsible for anywhere from around 80,000 deaths. Again, a legitimate, recognized terrorist group that's trying to take over a country. Right? They're no longer that powerful at all. There still is some level of violence, and we'll go into that as well. But I just kind of want to give you the historical context. But again, for decades, the U.S. was funding this guy, propping up this really corrupt dictator, all in the name. Because again, it was a very convenient narrative that we got to stop the war on drugs. So let me kind of give the appropriate context. So the vast majority of the cocaine in Peru, it's produced out of this region called the VRAEM. And in its heyday, the Shining Path really had control of that region. So they weren't actually producing the drug, they're taxing it. Much like most of these groups, you go throughout the world, if you hold territory, anything that goes to legitimate goods, illegal goods, you're just sort of taxing, for the lack of a better term, the cocaine production there. Well, guess what? The actual drug traffickers and the people moving the cocaine and the growers, they were connected with the de facto head of intelligence there for Peru, who was an absolute CIA darling. And again, this was going on for decades with just rampant corruption, all right out in the open. But again, it takes, the average person isn't really looking too deep into these issues. And again, it was just very convenient. We got to stop the war on drugs. We got to stop this, when really we were actually enabling the cocaine production there. So one of the headlines that you popped up there, I'm not saying that this violence has totally disappeared, but the Shining Path is an absolute shell of itself compared to what it was before. And again, Peru in many ways functioned like Colombia, where the armament, all the weapons, all that support that we gave, it did help to stop the shining path, to stop them from what they were doing. So again, the war on drugs was really a kind of, again, a counterinsurgency measure, a measure to help out a geopolitical ally of ours. So why I wanted to give that context again is because Alberto Fujimori's daughter is up for the election. It's basically this very close election. The Fujimori side, again, that the sort of right wing element of the country is going up against a pretty far left socialist. So obviously, with the U.S. media and the U.S. political apparatus, they're going to support the right wing person, even though this right wing person seems to be making some really ridiculous allegations of voter fraud and all this stuff to try to question the election. And we'll kind of go into Bolivia, how there's a parallel with that. Um, One thing, a side note I do kind of have to make here is that Fujimori, she's literally taken out of prison, was facing up to 30 years in prison for money laundering and corruption charges. She was part of that Odebrecht scandal, or at least allegedly. She hasn't actually gone on trial, so I do have to kind of watch my words. But that's just something that's ensnared, I mean, people throughout the continent there. And again, this is the person who they're putting up for office. This is the person who, in my opinion, in the near future, we're going to start seeing U.S. State Department people starting to really try to prop up and say, we need to enforce the integrity of this election. we're going to
Right.
start to see, in my opinion, we will be seeing that pretty soon. I might be wrong. Maybe I'm just a cynic. But there's just a lot of historical comparisons there that I do believe that is something that we will see.
Yeah. Well, I know on this show, one of the things that we really have covered that happened in South America was the coup in Bolivia. And as that
Mhm.
all unfolded, we are on it from the very beginning of like the OAS report that, oh, the results came in late. So there was something like wrong with it. And then I think CEPR and then MIT confirmation of those reports. So yeah, I think it's very much something I'm watching to see how it's going to progress there, because it seems like whenever somebody in like this region of the world gets elected that we don't like, the first accusation is to call the election illegitimate. Now, if that doesn't happen, they'll pull some Juan Guaido Venezuela stuff a year or two down the
Mhm.
road, but first
Mhm.
they're going to try to nullify the election, or at least enough to like sway it or get a second election or whatever they could do. So yeah,
Mhm.
anything else on Peru? And then is there any particular source that you would like kind of look at to keep an eye on in the coming months, something that like will translate well to English and everything?
That is a good question. I really don't know. I mean, to me, it's just so obvious. You just see the agenda from the U.S. media, UK media. Again, it's not just. I think that what we will see is you're going to start to see that suddenly the drug problem and the cocaine production is going to become more of a problem. That's going to become part of the narrative. And again, a lot of this comes down to, we want to prop up our military and our economic allies. And again, Peru has a lot of natural resources there as well. There are big multinational companies that do not want to see a socialist elected into office. They just don't want to see that. They don't want to see the minimum wage raised in those countries. They don't want to see the taxes and the tariffs raised in those countries, and the drug war, and the integrity of the election will help to advance that agenda for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, as far as a specific media source, I don't really know where I would point you
All right.
in that direction.
I will say, what was I gonna mention? Something in comparison with Venezuela, but if I remember, we could just move on, Furay, and talk a little bit about Bolivia then, and how the drug war is unfolding there.
Yeah. So, I mean, the drug war is extremely, extremely relevant in this conversation. So, just like you said, you covered I would call it a coup. Some people didn't want to call it a coup,
It was a
but
coup.
yeah, a coup took place. A coup took place, and the U.S. supported it quite a bit. Let's just say it that way. So, I think in order again to sort of understand current situations, I think it's important to kind of take a step back. Um, and there's actually another coup that I want to reference there in Bolivia, but let's kind of go back not quite as far. So Evo Morales is the socialist leader, or was the socialist leader of Bolivia, and again he did kind of help create the narrative, the convenient U.S. narrative that they wanted. The guy was in office for 4 years. Laws were changed. Again, not a huge supporter of Evo Morales. Again, I think one thing you'll see is I really try to shoot it down the middle. If it's left or right, I'm going to criticize them all. And I think as far as this conversation, probably one of the least corrupt. But that aspect you do have to criticize. Where's it going to go? Okay, so when you talk about Evo Morales, one of the first things that he did to really piss off the United States was kicking out the DEA of his country. So that really helped to create a narrative. And again, one of the things you have to know about Evo Morales is he's a former coca grower. So again, this is really like if that's all that you heard, like, okay, we think we know everything, and it's really not the case. So there is a legitimate market for legal coca, and that is what he was trying to promote. Now, I think myself, a lot of people have had suspicions, like, is it kind of a wink and a nudge to there is also a whole lot of illegal cocaine production in the country as well. But let's really kind of focus in on that the fact that he kicked the DEA out of his country early in office. So when he did so, it was in pretty public fashion, at least there, not much attention in the US media. And one of the things, that literally kind of doing it as a prop in a public appearance, he's holding up this book. It was called The Big White Lie. So The Big White Lie is just an absolute fantastic book. If you really believe the narrative on the drug war and the pro-America and all this, I suggest you read that book, challenge your line of thinking. So The Big White Lie is written by, in my opinion, the biggest whistleblower in DEA history, a guy named Michael Levine. And the point that he was making, he was stationed throughout Latin America, very high profile DEA agent. And basically the claims, and he made plenty of proof to show it, was that the DEA essentially spiked his investigations to take down, at that time, the largest cocaine producer in the world. So let me kind of back that up, and let's give you a pop culture reference to really kind of paint the picture. I don't know if any of you guys watched the movie Scarface. And again, the reason why I mention it is that because a lot of this stuff really was out in the open. So Scarface came out in the early 1980s, and some people have watched that movie several times. But there's this sort of shadowy CIA figure who's always kind of like rubbing shoulders. I forget the character's name, but it's essentially playing off of a real guy named Roberto Suarez, who is the biggest cocaine producer in the world. And it's alluding to the fact that the CIA was rubbing shoulders to shoulders with the biggest drug trafficker in the world, who was in bed with their puppet in Bolivia, who took over in a coup in the early 80s, which is in many ways been labeled the cocaine coup, because that put them in office. Some of this stuff is almost too hard to believe. I'll sound like a crazy man. You got to kind of read a little bit what I'm talking about. Part of that person was a guy named Klaus Barbie, a former Nazi criminal, part of a program called Operation Paperclip. Which again, I know that's probably starting to sound pretty crazy, but you got to kind of look into that and read into it. That's why I'm kind of trying to drop a lot of different names in a quick period of time. But what Michael Levine was pointing out, and there was this, I'm going to paraphrase a quote it's just been embedded in my brain ever since I read it. I'm going to do my best to try to remember it. But basically he goes, listen, in the DA database, we've got every nickel and dime corner drug dealer listed in our entire database. Roberto Suarez was not in there. The biggest drug trafficker in the world, the guy who he's trying to take down. And again, basically his point is that they were protected. And the thing is, you have to realize that the DA is essentially also an intelligence agency. So it gets complex, and this is a complex topic that's tough to kind of sum up in a couple of minutes. I'm going to do my best shot at it. And again, there are the rank and file people like a Michael Levine who really are going out there and trying to stop drug production and doing their job and doing it, in his opinion, putting his life on the line, not in his opinion, putting their life on the line, risking their lives to try to do this mission. And then they get stabbed in the back because at the end of the day, the DEA and the CIA have to work together. What you'll see is always the DEA is losing that battle. The CIA always wins. If there's an asset in that country, and it doesn't matter what they're up to, the DA's priorities are going to lose every
Mm,
single time. And Michael Levine took a lot of risks to do what he did. I mean, this is a guy who exposed all of this stuff. Um, so my point of that, again, I'm trying to sum it up, and it's kind of tough to do it all super short. But Evo Morales is holding up this book talking about this and showing how, again, the DEA, again, not everyone in the DEA is acting as some sort of spy. Many of them are sort of doing their jobs. But at the end of the day, they're also collecting intelligence. And that really helped to create a narrative for the US media that, oh my God, this former coca grower, and he's kicking the DEA out of the country. My God, must be the most
mm-hmm.
corrupt guy out there. And again, I think anybody looks at my work, again, I'm not a lefty, not a righty. I shoot it how I see it. And when you look at some of these countries with a chance, I think he's one of the less corrupt. Nobody's perfect. Like every politician's got a little dirt on him. But I point to him as a pretty straight shooter. And again, he was doing that. I think there's multiple reasons. I think he enjoyed kind of thumbing his nose at the U.S., but knowing that all along that these are groups who supported a coup. Well, guess what? They don't like this guy. They don't like his agenda. They're probably going to try to advance another coup.
Right.
Well, even without them there, there was the recent coup, and the United States absolutely did support that. Um, Again, the drug war didn't really come into that so much in the narrative there when this happened. But again, it's just all part of a convenient excuse. Again, lots of production there in Bolivia. But again, it's nothing compared to what it used to be once. What's kind of crazy, once we kick the people who were supposed to stop this stuff out of there, production's gone down some, and yet it has actually gone up in the area where we're supposed to be conducting this. And I'm not trying to sound like Mr. Conspiracy Guy. There's more to it than that. That's an oversimplification, but that is also kind of an end result as well. Does that kind of make sense what I just said, or
Yeah,
no?
yeah,
Or?
and I don't think anybody in my audience is gonna have trouble believing any of this. I mean, we know about the Timber Sycamore program and the arming of the Syrian rebels. We know that heroin or opium growth had exploded in regions in Afghanistan after some of the U.S. interventions. Now, I don't think all that was because they were like trying to create a bunch of heroin to bring to the U.S. They thought of that,
No,
they thought,
I hate that narrative.
right.
I've heard that stuff many times. I'm glad that you said that. Yes,
Because
I
I
couldn't.
think what they're
I
trying to
don't
do,
anyway agree with that.
yeah, is just to help the farmers be able to pump more water. And then the farmers are like, well, then we could grow twice as much opium rather than growing whatever the U.S. thought we were going to grow because it's that much more valuable. I mean, that's just, markets at work, right? It's a stupid decision. That's why the empire falls apart. But anything else you have on Bolivia? If not, I think we could transfer to, I think, what you labeled as the countries that more distribute the cocaine than grow it. And I was remembering my point about Peru that I just want to add, which, and
Mhm.
this leads into Venezuela. And when they planned the whole coup in Venezuela and backed Juan Guaido, the group was called the Lima Group. And so I'm guessing that the new leadership in Peru, assuming it's the farmer guy and not the woman, I'm guessing isn't going to have the next Venezuelan coup planned in their capital, and so this is part of the reason why the U.S. is so interested in what happens.
Yeah, I just kind of, I just want to address that one last point, exactly what you said. I'm glad that you said that. My takeaway, and because you can look at so many of these I would say government sponsored drug traffickers. Yes, I've heard that is not the conclusion that I come to. What I come to the conclusion of, it's really more of a matter of convenience. Um, the CIA in the United States, and again, the CIA, I think we kind of like label the CIA. The CIA is an extension of the United States. It's just an extension of the president. They're doing the dirty work that the president wants,
Most of the
right?
time, at least.
Yeah, exactly,
They
right.
might go off script
So,
every now and then, but most of the time.
but yeah, exactly. But I think that that's also kind of a convenient narrative as well, right there too. Um, but what's happening is, and yeah, there's certain areas where we want to kind of assert our agenda, and yeah, if they're whatever they're involved in, whatever dirty money they're involved in, dirty money helps to fight, for lack of a term, dirty wars, and we're going to kind of manage. the drug war. So when our opponents or rivals, we're going to make a big deal about it. We're going to go after them. We're going to go after those ones, and we're going to turn a blind eye when our allies are neck deep in this stuff as well. And again, that's kind of an oversimplification to a complex issue.
Let's move on to Venezuela.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay, so man, where do we start with Venezuela? Where do we start with Venezuela? Let's start with the current, probably in my opinion, one of the more apt current situations. So in Venezuela, there's basically a war going on in a very concentrated, area, a state called Apure, which is a border state with Colombia. So kind of getting back to what we were talking about there as well, there are a lot of these sort of dissident groups in Colombia, and they've for decades kind of had safe haven in Venezuela. So again, we've been kind of poking at the corrupt right wing people. It's time to kind of poke at the corrupt left wing people. And this relationship, it's gone on for decades, where the FARC, the ELN, they've had safe passage, and they've controlled certain levels and areas within, I shouldn't say control, but they have a strong presence in the country in certain areas. So essentially the way that sort of worked, for the lack of a better explanation, is they're the transit country, right? Venezuela doesn't really produce cocaine, although there's a little bit of that starting to happen. It's because, as you see, Colombia is its neighbor. There's a tremendous demand for that cocaine to go off to Europe and to the United States, or throughout Latin America. So it's really a transit country. So those different Marxist groups, they've been very much aligned with high elements of the Venezuelan military and government. And again, when we got back to the whole taxing issue, that's been part of it. It's helped to fund the Venezuelan leadership there. I mean, there's evidence as far back as the 90s. One of these members of the FARC, I'm trying to remember, Paul Reyes, right? Where they're showing that like he funded Chavez, as early as the 90s, and this was a reciprocal relationship. So let me kind of tie that back to current time. So there's literally warfare going on in this state. There's people who are literally being displaced from their homes. They need to leave the area because there's so much warfare going on. One of these dissident FARC groups, I mean, there was a recent headline, they literally kidnapped 8 Venezuelan soldiers, and vice versa. Just a lot of this coming to a head. And the main takeaway, what most people interpret, that's my sort of like secondhand interpretation as well, is that there was always sort of this copacetic relationship where these groups, they get to move the drugs through the country, get it to that point, and they always had to sort of pay their taxes to the military, the government apparatus. And it seems to be that there's really just sort of a beef going on between these two sides as far as the flow of the cocaine through that country. So yeah, I mean, again, Venezuela is not a production country, but if you looked at the news media coverage, you would kind of believe it. Because when we talk about drugs and we talk about what's going on, it's typically Maduro, signs pointing to him, and cocaine, and that it's always public enemy number one. Whereas, again, we have to remember there's basically practically none produced there. It's just the transshipment point. It has that unfortunate reality of being a neighbor to one of the largest producers there. Yet again, the media coverage, the politics that all goes behind it, you would think that the Maduro is Pablo Escobar. Right. And again, I'm not a big fan of Maduro. It's in my opinion a very corrupt administration there, neck deep in it. But like I said, it's like we need to poke at both sides, the left and the right, and it's totally appropriate in this case. Where should we go? Okay, so let's kind of talk a little bit about this hypocrisy there. So you pointed to coups again. There's been multiple coups, or at least coup attempts. So let's go back to, I'm sorry, it's late on a Friday. I think it was 2002. That was the one coup attempt against Hugo Chavez. So who were the people who carried that out? These were Venezuelan generals who were trained in the United States. Your audience is going to be very familiar with that name, or the School of the Americas. Anybody who isn't familiar with that name, let's go back into this. So if you look at pretty much any coup that has taken place in Latin America, almost inevitably they were trained in the United States at the School of Americas. We can look, I mean, taught torture, everything. This is basically an indoctrination destination there. So many scandals that just changed the name to the acronym WHINSEC, Western Hemispheric. I forget the rest of it. But again, in Latin America, they call that the school of the coup. I mean, you look at pretty much every coup. Again, they've come there, and what they get in that training, it's supposed to be counter narcotics training at the School of Americas. Again, what a coincidence that, again, whenever these coups take place or attempted coups, almost every time somebody is coming from the School of Americas. The recent one that we mentioned in Peru, again, a general who was trained at the School of Americas, graduate there. So many times whenever there's some sort of right-wing puppet dictator in Latin America, and again, oversimplifying, but you can almost always point that arrow back to the School of Americas. So these people, and again, Hugo Chavez also kicked the DEA out of his country. Now, in Hugo Chavez's case, unlike Morales, I'm like, there was a reciprocal relationship there. How much so, I don't know necessarily enriching himself, but again, keeping that military apparatus happy. You got to keep them fat and happy so that they don't overthrow you. But again, Chavez did kick them out of the country as well. But in my opinion, one of the most apropos examples that I really need to point to is this was back in the early 1990s. And again, we forget about stuff. We just see stuff and we're like, oh my God, that's crazy. And then we go on to the next thing and we've forgotten about it. So there was this episode of 60 Minutes back in the day, early 90s, where the head of the DEA is talking about a Venezuelan general who was an asset of the CIA. I apologize, I'm forgetting the name right now. But basically, roughly around 20 tons of cocaine were shipped into the United States. This was all part of the CIA said that this would be sort of like a sting operation where this general is supposed to infiltrate the ranks, and then we can kind of get to the drug producers. Well, the point is the drugs were supposed to be intercepted. The drugs never got intercepted. They made its way to the street. Tons of cocaine took place. And eventually this general was indicted by the Department of Justice. Now, again, he was still living in Venezuela. Well, guess what? He was never extradited to the United States. So this CIA asset responsible for tons and tons of cocaine, let's just say, like, if he wasn't an asset, I'm pretty sure you'd never, see the freedom of day. So I bring that up because that's the early 90s. So he's never extradited to the United States. Later on, and again, I don't know if it's entirely factual, there is some persecution that does take place in Venezuela, but that same general is arrested again, remember, roughly about 2007, if I remember right, on charges that he was trying to instigate a coup against the government there, which, again, when we look at history and we look at it, maybe not unfounded, but I just think we need to point out that you got to think about that. Let's kind of connect these dots. A general who we know the head of the DA says was a major drug trafficker, somebody who was a CIA asset, who was never actually extradited to the United States to serve his time in prison for moving tons of cocaine, who then is later accused of trying to overthrow the government in Venezuela. So it's, again, it just kind of gets back to that narrative of convenience, and again, the way that we manage the war on drugs. And again, I'm not trying to protect the Maduro regime at all. I mean, you can look at it. There is a ton of violence in that country. There's a ton of corruption directly tied to the drug trade there, and a lot of it does point to high-ranking officials. They call it the term the cartel of the sons. It has to do with the insignia on their uniforms, and it has to do with the generals. So there's a very high level of corruption within that government that is absolutely enabling the flow of cocaine here to the United States, everywhere. But again, that's the stuff that you hear about. That's the corruption that you hear. You don't hear so much when it's, like I said, when it's a strong U.S. ally.
Yeah. So, we're coming up on time here, but I would like to hear about Honduras, and that was the subject of your most recent article you published at the American Conservative. Honduras is a bona fide narco state, yet Trump praises its useful leader. I'm guessing that they'll get similar treatment from Biden now that he's in office. So, Brian, tell us a little bit about what's happening in Honduras.
Yeah, so this is an even more extreme example. So, like I said, there's a lot of corruption there in Venezuela. Absolutely. And again, it's not like I'm some guy who's got an agenda for them, like on either side. But Honduras, in my opinion, it is just far, the corruption it is just unbelievable. So let's just kind of break that down, try to give highlights because there's just so much and I don't even know where. Let's just start with the president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez. His brother is in United States prison right now, serving life sentence after life sentence. I think I got my notes. Yeah. Convicted for trafficking 185 tons of cocaine into the United States. That's the brother of the president of Honduras. You look at the AP, you'll see an article or two. You don't hear too much about this stuff. The president of Honduras is also an unindicted co-conspirator in that trial. Could you imagine if they had the same evidence against, Maduro or one of these opponents? I can guarantee that we would be trying to get him here on U.S. soil. Honduras is a military and economic ally. Again, when we talk about coups, there was another coup that took place back in 2009, U.S. supported, and it is installed. Again, you removed a fairly left of center, not like a super socialist leader there, but a democratically elected leader, all supported by the United States. We've continued to ship military equipment there. You can just go down the list. I mean, the corruption is all the way to the top. There are several, and again, you got to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt, but I mean, high level drug traffickers who openly said this is how it worked. Like we were working with the president of Honduras hand in hand. And I mean, you can literally, I mean, you can just list it off. The multiple drug czars assassinated by drug traffickers. His own, like I said, his cousin, who's the head of the police, also charged by the United States. He's not charged. I mean, you can just, I mean, just official after official after official going all the way to the top. And the person that they're one of the people who's kind of considered one of the candidates for replacing him is a guy who's been convicted for money laundering, who was part of the cabinet there. Again, I don't want to just keep listing off name after name after name, but that is the imbalance. And that is what just truly bothers me about this. Because, I mean, Honduras, there's been so much more violence and just, I mean, the drug war essentially has enabled a lot of that. We continue to arm this country that commits there's behind a horrible human rights abuses in that country. And again, because it is a military ally and it's also an economic ally. And when we say economic ally, and when I say it, it really kind of does come down to a left-right issue, even though the Democrats in office are not really, they're the ones supporting this. Again, that coup took place during the Obama administration. Mr. Nobel Prize winner, who couldn't help but to continue to fund this really corrupt regime that was just murdering behind the murders of people. And again, in many ways, trying to protect U.S. multinational corporate interests in that country.
Yeah. No, that was that crazy situation. I believe even the coup government there hired the Podesta group to like lobby for them in the U.S. And then the U.S. went on to train. I think it's called the Tiger Force. At least that's the acronyms used.
Mm-hmm.
That has suppressed the hell out of protest and
Mm-hmm.
protesters standing up to the government there. And also, I could just imagine a situation where if the Maduro government was this involved, this linked, they got his brother in a U.S. jail. And I mean, it'd certainly be a much bigger deal. You would know everybody's names, but they may be even go as far as to start like trying to rack up like people who OD on cocaine in the U.S. as deaths we gotta attribute to the Hernandez government in Nicaragua or in Honduras, and it's just so. And then of course you look at the immigration crisis, which they could probably would roll into that if they could, and just that you hear absolutely none of it is completely ridiculous. But we should probably wrap up, Brian. I guess the last thing I would just be interested in particularly Honduras, like Colombia, Venezuela, Peru are a little bit bigger states. They have a little bit bigger economies. I have to imagine that, especially when you get into Central America and all these countries are so small, when you're talking about the portion of their economy that has to go through the black market, through the U.S. trafficking, the cocaine and drug trafficking, has to be huge and has to like make it nearly impossible to have a non-corrupt government in one of those countries, simply because there's a lot of rich people who got rich on the drug trade, and then they bribed the
Mhm.
government.
Yeah, I mean, and that is the case. One thing, and you brought up, I would be remiss if I didn't mention it, but the nephews of the first lady in Venezuela were convicted for drug trafficking, so it is pretty high level. But to me, like, there's another level when literally the president isn't is an unindicted co-conspirator on a case, worth 185 tons of cocaine. But yes, what you brought up is that's one of the key points that's always bothered me, and I think sometimes people can think that I'm oversimplifying it by saying that, okay, if we end the war on drugs, that it just ends all of this corruption and violence, which I'm not saying, but boy, it absolutely creates it. When you've got a $100 billion market for this straight north, and I'm not sure exactly the size over there in Europe. I mean, and we're talking in countries with lower GDPs. I mean, come on, like that is going to happen. We're going to create that. We're creating a certain level of violence there. So here's the last stat I saw where we looked at the highest murder rates in the world. 47 of them are in this hemisphere. Quite a few of them here in the United States, by the way. Only three of them outside this in South Africa, which is also, a drug trafficking transit point as well. Again, there's several issues there. There are lots of gangs and crimes there as well, but it's a component. But most of it's concentrated in Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil. And we didn't go into Brazil's like a whole other topic, but even if you look at the geography there within those high homicide rates, in Brazil, for example, almost all of them are along the coastline. Again, and Brazil is a pretty big destination country, at least as far as cocaine consumption, probably the second highest in the world. But at the end of the day, it's a transit country, and by its geography, there's just so much violence that's going to occur as a result of this black market. But yeah, I mean, you can look at it; it's concentrated in certain areas, and that's the other thing that I didn't want people to sort of label these countries as like narco states, et cetera. I think that we have to have more nuance to that. But my general takeaway is, again, if we could end that policy, it really would reduce quite a bit of violence in the world, and it could be done with the stroke of a pen.
Right.
And the United States can be the leader on that. I mean, we're seeing talks about legalization and stuff like we're very slowly, but there's just so much to this topic that the average person really just doesn't understand. And I appreciate you giving me the platform here because hopefully anybody's listening, maybe they learned a little something, gave them a little different perspective.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about all of this. And honestly, I probably want to ask you like 20 more questions as we are going through this show.
I could talk for days.
So we'll have to do it again soon. Especially, I know you want to get the podcast going again and everything. But tell people where they could find your work, where they could keep up with you if you drop new content, new articles, where you post all that.
Yeah, so you mentioned, I kind of post articles in some other places. I've started doing some original content on my own website. That's the plan, is to do more of it. Kind of got a lot of different projects I'm trying to work on. I'm not specializing or focusing on anything is the problem. I'm trying to do too much. But yeah, my website is my name. It's the spelling of my name, Brian Saady, BrianSaady.com. You can see I've got a podcast called Rackets. I've got a book series called Rackets. That's the general focus of my work. So the drug war is obviously part of it. I try to focus on a lot of stuff, from anything from corporate crime, corruption, anything that, like, for the lack of a better term, is a racket. And that's a lot of different wide array. But in my opinion, part of why I focus probably mostly on the drug war is, again, I just think that there's so many levels of negativity that come about from it. And I think that that's really one of the biggest ones out there. So yeah, if you're interested, if you found this at all interesting, I think you would like some of the content on my website there at briansady.com.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Cool.